Well, hello everyone. There are no participants here, so please excuse me if I'm a little bit awkward today. I'm just going to be sort of talking at my computer. And that actually brings to mind something that I wanted to put out there is that if anybody has any feedback about scheduling or about class topics or anything like that, I'd be glad to hear, take requests or both for topics and for timing. I've been trying to really vary the time of the classes so that people with different schedules can make it to different ones. This kind of like late afternoon time, I was kind of wondering if it was going to be a strange time for people, particularly in the summer. So please feel free to give me feedback about that. I know that a lot of people watch the recordings and it gets to be quite a lot to try to schedule to be here when the class is happening, but also know that if you are a person who watches the recordings, I'm really happy to take questions from you as well. All right, so I guess I'll just go ahead and get started here. So today, what we're going to be talking about is the microbiome. And really, this is split into two different sections, partially because first I really wanted to talk about what microbiome is and how it functions and why it's so important for us to be thinking about. And then the second is really about what we do to support our microbiomes. Only a small portion of that conversation next week is going to be about probiotics. That it is really important to think about quality of probiotics and talk about which probiotics, but really when companies who are selling probiotics get too focused on taking the probiotics, they're really missing a big piece of what I really think of as being key to supporting the microbiome, and that is really supported by the evidence in the literature, is that what we eat really feeds good bacteria and good virus, makes our microbiome a healthier sort of mix, a healthier balance. And so really it's a little bit separate from what probiotics we take orally, although those have a time and a place that I definitely use them. When we think about the microbiome, we're not just thinking about what are we ingesting, we're thinking about what's already living in our bodies and how can we support that. So just kind of to kind of step back and sort of have a moment of thinking about what our microbiome is. I really think of it as being another organ, because it really is so important to our health. If we did kill all the bacteria in our body, we would die pretty quickly. And so we're really dependent on these bacteria to do so many different functions. And really, in terms of like the numbers that we're talking about of how many bacteria are in our bodies, there, depends on who you ask, because there's some conflicting sort of estimates here, but roughly 10 times as many bacterial cells as human cells in your body, which is kind of like to really stop and think about that. We're in some ways more bacteria than human. And I had a microbiology professor who used to talk about how he had this like kind of idea that the bacteria just made humans in like, sort of like supported growth of living beings. And I apologize that I realize that might be contrary to some people's beliefs. So I apologize about that. But also just kind of like this sort of perspective on it is a funny way to think about it, is like, oh, are the bacteria just driving us around, like trying to get us? And they really like humans because we can get on a plane and like, get some new friends from Kenya or from, Thailand, and then bring them back home, or we can go, or they can drive us to the refrigerator to get some ice cream or sweets. So anyway, that's the a little, and again, I realize that that's for some people might be contrary to their beliefs, and also at the same time, I think that really, kind of any way we look at it, this really incredible relationship between bacteria and living beings is pretty incredible once you kind of step into it, and once you realize like all of the levels of benefit that both bacteria and humans get from the relationship that we've had for all of this time. So really, this is a very new science when we talk about the microbiome, partially because we're prior to, maybe like not even really 15 years ago or so, 10, 15 years ago, the main way that we learned about the microbiome was to take bacteria, and this is how we always do, how people study bacteria, is to take things, put them on a plate and see what grows out. So that's called a culture, when you put something on a petri dish and you have a substance that makes the bacteria grow, and then you look at what grows out under the microscope, and you can tell, what kinds of bacteria were present. This is really limiting when we're talking about bacteria that exist in the GI tract, partially because so many of the bacteria there are really good at surviving in areas where there's no oxygen, where the conditions are a little bit more extreme. And so then when you take them out and put them on a petri dish, some of them don't survive in that scenario, that they really can't survive out in the air. So it becomes very limiting in terms of like how much we can study them and understand what they're doing, both how many of them there are and how they're growing and things like that, but also in terms of what they're doing, in terms of what metabolites they're producing. So metabolites are the what is produced by the metabolism of the bacteria. So we'll talk about a few different types of metabolites that are things so they're basically the waste product of bacteria that do benefit us. So there's a few of them that we know about, and there's probably far more. There's kind of like a growing body of research about the metabolites that these bacteria make, that there's probably far more that we don't know about now, but in 5 or 10 years, we'll be all talking about them. So, really, this is an exploding area of science, and all kinds of associations have come forth in terms of between the microbiome and our health. Everything from risk of autoimmune disease to intestinal permeability to risk of atopic, which basically means allergic phenomena or ways of immune responses, I should say. So really it's quite cool, and even to mental health. Like there's been some really wild studies about mental health and probiotics, and both in animal studies as well as human studies, and using like endpoints that are pretty not as susceptible to placebo. And some of these have been placebo-controlled trials as well. But really the one that I'm thinking about, Alan Gaby talked about in a conference that was about people who had acute mania, and then they gave them all probiotics. It was a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, and the group that got the probiotics was really significantly less likely to be readmitted to the hospital within the following, I think it was 2 years, and so remarkably so. And so just that, it's like, whoa, what is happening there? And what's happening in this kind of like growing area of science is that we're seeing these kinds of patterns, but not knowing exactly why they are happening. So we don't know which metabolite it is. We don't know what pathway that is being affected. We don't know really anything about what that means. Why is that happening? So kind of moving down, I'm going to work through this this handout. I just got worried that I'm not on the correct meeting, so maybe that's why people aren't here. Oh no, okay, yeah, okay, sorry. So in terms of the microorganisms that we're talking about, so the microbiome is a general term for all of the microorganisms that exist within and on the human body. So we have microorganisms that exist on our skin, in our eyes, in our mouths, in our nose, in all of our body cavities, in our lungs, in our digestive tracts, on our genitals, really, I guess that's really in our food, and so that microbiome is made up of bacteria, fungi, viruses, which you might be surprised that that's part of that, and parasites. Bacteria, there's kind of a lot we know about, like people know the name E. coli, and also a lot of times lactobacillus, but there's also many different species of lactobacillus. Bifidobacterium is another one that gets talked about a lot. Those are a lot of the ones that are studied, and we also know about, E. coli can be a normal bacteria, but it can also be, there's a form of it that can be really very create a really bad infection. And so, but there's literally thousands of species of bacteria, and many of them are just, kind of being understood or discovered, and most of them we have no idea what they really do. But there's some that we've really, been able to see that they're associated with infection, but then there's other ones that we don't know to what is the effect of them, their presence. So, and really, one of the things that we look at here is about diversity, that really the diversity of the bacteria is a really big indicator for health. And then also there's this other piece that happens, where it's just the environment that the bacteria are in will make them produce different things. So, and that comes back again to food. So really, when we put the same bacteria in two different environments, that will actually produce different metabolites, which will have different effects. So we'll talk more about like the specifics about the metabolites, and kind of thinking about how the environment is just as important as the bacteria. But part of the environment is really about what other bacteria are around, and the health of the community is in its diversity. And that is true also for bacteria, and the way that when there's many different types of bacteria, the whole ecosystem of the microbiome is really the healthiest, and has the most positive health effects. Fungi, a lot of times people have like a really, negative feeling about fungi in the digestive tract. There was I think it was like 15 years ago-ish, I remember it was a big to do about candida, and how candida is the cause of everything. It's true that a lot of people do have a little bit more candida in their bodies than is ideal, and that when I think of that as really a sign that something is happening with the bacterial levels, more so than a cause of a lot of the problems. So really, when I think about candida, my first goal is not just to get rid of candida, because that's not really the whole issue. What's actually happening is often the candida, which is that yeast, it sort of fills up fills up any vacuum. So if you take antibiotics, for example, that's kind of the lived experience that many people can relate to, is they take antibiotics and they'll get like a yeast infection in their mouth, or a vaginal yeast infection, or their armpits will get really itchy or something like that. And basically what's happening is that you're taking an antibiotic, you're killing a bunch of bacteria. It creates a big sort of open space, basically, not literally, but creates a decreased number of the bacteria in the body, and then therefore the yeast can kind of grow to fill that space. And they have the advantage because they're not affected by the antibiotics. So really though, but I actually wanted to put a little shout out for yeast, because there's another yeast that I use therapeutically very often, called Saccharomyces boulardii, which is actually an anti-inflammatory fungus, and has been shown to be really effective for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, as well as for C. difficile, which is an infection that happens for a lot of people after they've been taking antibiotics, where the antibiotics kill all the good bacteria, and then there's this overgrowth of a bacteria called Clostridium difficile, which then causes a really severe diarrhea. And Saccharomyces boulardii is a really necessary, really wonderful treatment for C. difficile as well, along with a lot of times we do that in conjunction with other antibiotics that are effective for C. difficile, mostly because C. difficile can get so serious so fast. So viruses, what we're talking about here is mostly about, so I'm going to focus on one type of virus, but there's a lot of conversation about, like, are there viruses that more viruses that kind of hang out in our body, all the things, there's a lot of different questions about viral particles. Viruses are really wild, actually, when you really stop and think about them. They're not living, and yet they reproduce, like just that. There it is. Like, whoa. So they actually use the cell to reproduce themselves. So they use a living cell, and usually it's kind of specific to a type of animal or a bacteria, and so they reproduce that way. So the reason I kind of bring that up is because I want to talk about a specific kind of virus that only affects bacteria. So this is a virus that might exist in your body, or exists in many people's bodies and animals' bodies, and it only impacts the bacteria. It does not infect the human cells. And so there's some research happening and some use of these, like, trial use of these. Specifically, it's a big area of research in Russia. They're called phages. So the bacteriophages are the type of virus that affect only bacteria. And this research is really looking at, can we use those phages therapeutically? So could we intentionally have someone ingest a virus that would kill a certain kind of bacteria? And the reason this is such an important area of research is because antimicrobials, there's been this big conversation about the fact that there are no new antimicrobials coming. And so basically we have these, a limited number of antimicrobials. Antibiotics is what I'm really talking about when I say antimicrobials. And I mean, also antifungals, because that's a whole other issue, is that we're getting some super fungi that are difficult to treat with antifungals. But anyway, so we have this limited amount of medications that can treat infection, and we're getting more and more resistance to those medications. So one of the things about bacteria that's really amazing, actually, is that they are highly adaptable for a few reasons. One is that they replicate so quickly that they, their generations, they're going, whenever they can create they're basically producing new generations all the time. And so they can really selectively reproduce the bacteria that are resistant to the antibiotic. So say you have this group of, I'm going to use E. coli because you have this group of E. coli, you give antibiotics. The ones that, so say even if you have 100 and only 2 really would survive that antibiotic, those, those 2 can continue to replicate, and you end up with now a new strain of that bacteria that is resistant to that antibiotic. And then bacteria also have another whole mechanism. Some bacteria, I should say, not all bacteria, have another mechanism where they can actually share their DNA. So between 2 living organisms, they can share their DNA and basically confer that resistance to each other. So that would be like, if I could go up to my friend and be like, hey, I'm not allergic to poison ivy. Do you want some of my genes? And if I was that friend, I'd be like, yes, please. because yeah, so basically they have this ability to share DNA and share, so that one bacteria can share with another bacteria certain amounts of resistance. So one of the things that I just want to say about that is that that's where natural medicine is really different than a lot of antimicrobials that we have that are antibiotics that we take. Partially because when we take an antibiotic, it has a single mechanism of action, so it has one way of killing bacteria, right? And so, like for example, amoxicillin, a lot of bacteria became resistant to amoxicillin because they basically stopped the amoxicillin from being able to get into the cell. And so then now we have the amoxicillin with clavulanate, which then is able to get into the cell better. And so it kind of overrides that bacteria's resistance to it. But then what happens if you're working with a natural substance, like say garlic or oregano or like andrographis or so many others they have multiple mechanisms of actions that are all happening at the same time. And so therefore it's much harder for that bacteria to develop a resistance to that. The other thing is with natural medicine, natural therapeutics, most of the time it doesn't have as much of an effect on the good bacteria. So it tends to preserve the microbial balance, but just sort of target those bacteria that are more problematic. So it's just, the drawback is it's not as strong. The other thing is there's some people out there who get really anti-medications in general, including antibiotics. And I always want to remind people that, before antibiotics, the average life expectancy was about 40 years old. So really, really antibiotics are the main thing that has extended our lifespan, along with so many other things like clean water. Of course, that's a big one. And also, but really that kind of like there's a time and a place, is that antibiotics have really made a huge difference in just our lifespans and in our survivability. And so, I think that, we can use them judiciously and really appreciate that, what they really are, what a tool they are. So these bacteriophages, really are going back to that piece. The bacteriophages are a virus that affects the bacteria. And I think in our lifetimes, we'll see that being used therapeutically as a way to treat infection. More to come on that, I'm sure. Also parasites. So there's some parasites that are not really considered part of the microbiome because they're not micro, so they're macro. So that's, more of like the worms and things like that. But there's a lot of protozoa parasites that are part of the microbiome. Giardia, Blastocystis, Cryptosporidium. Blastocystis, Cryptosporidium are often present as part of the microbiome. Giardia less so, like Giardia often is more, pathogenic, meaning that it'll give people more of like a diarrhea, digestive upset, sometimes vomiting. And entamoebas, same thing. A lot of times they're more pathogenic, so they'll produce symptoms. Plasmodium and Toxoplasma. Toxoplasma is around, it's sort of like one of those that can cause trouble. And, same thing with Blastocystis and Cryptosporidium, is that in large numbers, these can cause a lot of trouble. And then sometimes they're just kind of around. So Toxoplasma is kind of like most significant in pregnancy. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of what is the microbiome. It's all of these different microorganisms, and also like within that too, like I just want to like sort of when I think about the microbiome, it's about, what we're really talking about is not just these organisms as if they're separate entities, but really that all of the interactions between them, all the interactions between them and our bodies, and also all of the interactions between them and the food that we eat. So meaning that certain foods really support them, certain foods are, make it support certain strains or certain species, or certain types of microorganisms, and also, what kind of environment we're creating for them. So the other thing to note about environment that really sort of does play into how our microorganisms survive is actually about the mucus production. So mucus is something that gets produced on all of our surfaces, or all of our mucosal surfaces. So that's like our nose, mouth, throat, digestive tract, all of those kind of basically like wet surfaces, and inside of our lungs. So they so that mucus creates this little like a protection, both for the tissue itself, but also it really is important for feeding the bacteria, so that's kind of part of that environment that gets created that supports the good bacteria. One of the things that's an interesting piece that a person I was at a conference, an immunologist was talking about the relationship between stress and the microbiome, and how that's been established that when people are under higher stress, that their microbiome, the diversity of their microbiome decreases, and they have a little bit more of this tendency towards the bacteria that are a little bit more pro-inflammatory versus anti-inflammatory. And one of the proposed mechanisms of that is that when we're stressed, we actually produce less of that mucus barrier, that mucus layer. So you can kind of think about if you're stressed and you go to speak, how your mouth often gets dry, or if you those kinds of that's a very good example of that way that mucus barrier just kind of decreases a lot. Same thing with there's well, I won't go into that. There's kind of a lot to say about gastritis, but that mucus barrier is very important for the support of these microorganisms. And there's a couple of nutrients we'll talk about that support that mucus barrier, but also just the regular practices of sleep and finding times to rest and to do things that are enjoyable actually supports our microbiome as well. So, so I'm going to go through kind of like what we're talking about when we're talking about bacteria, because, you know, people are really so used to being, you know, certain people talk about being germaphobes and things like that. And I just sort of want to be like, okay, so, you know, bacteria are not, you know, they can have many different relationships with bacteria, right? So we kind of, we often, you know, think about the one of bacteria being infectious and problematic. So those are called pathogenic bacteria. So those are the bacteria that make us sick. And really, and I shouldn't say bacteria, pathogenic viruses, pathogenic fungi, pathogenic parasites. So, I mean, parasites kind of by definition are a little bit pathogenic. Well, I mean, actually, there's always an exception when it comes to medicine and life, is that, you know, there's some questions coming up these days about whether or not, you know, parasites can actually be a little bit beneficial for us in terms of modulating different parts of our immune system. So that's a really interesting, exciting area of research right now. Okay, and then so parasitic is technically a subtype of pathogenic. And parasitic is a kind of organism that benefits, so it's basically taking something from the host, and so the host is losing something and the parasite is gaining something. And again, you know, this might be more complex than we think it is. So, you know, there might be another benefit that a human organism is getting from having parasites, which is that it might decrease allergic responses and inflammatory responses. Really interesting stuff. Commensal, this used to be like the word that was used for all of these bacteria, commensal bacteria. And, you know, even like when I was in medical school, commensal bacteria was always the thing that we wanted to talk to about them. But really what we're learning is they're not just, so commensal would mean that they're just there and, you know, it's just sort of not, it's like not harmful or really helpful. It's just like, they're just there. They just kind of happen to be there. But what we're finding more and more is that most of the time, like many of these microorganisms have a mutualistic or beneficial relationship with us, where both parties are benefiting. So the microbe is benefiting because they're getting food delivered directly to their hometown, and we're benefiting because they're creating metabolites that help us out, and they're also protecting us from other infections, and we'll talk about all the things that they're doing. So yeah, I was about to ask for questions, but there's no one here to ask questions. So yeah, so those are all the different relationships we can have with bacteria. And I think that, you know, over time, what I anticipate is that we're going to learn more about there being even more benefits and mutualistic type relationships. When I mentioned about the studies going on about parasites and just sort of like the conversation that's happening around parasites in certain arenas, is that they're having people with autoimmune conditions, and they're basically intentionally giving them parasites, and seeing that their immune system is really shifting away from autoimmune activity, or atopic activity, which is more of like the allergic type activity. Really interesting, you know, sort of idea and concept is basically, so the way that even kind of got started as a question is the idea that, like, you know, humans for all time have had parasites, you know, like that's a really pretty normal state for humans, is to have some parasites. It's really very recent that we don't have parasites. So, and here we are, you know, seeing the rise of autoimmunity and the rise of atopic conditions, which is really that, you know, allergic type condition. And so the idea is that if you had, your immune system kind of has like multiple different responses. One is kind of a response like it would have to a bacteria or a virus, which is that, you know, have a fever, you know, that kind of thing. Then there's another type of response that's more of an parasitic type of response. And that's actually what we think about, you know, that's the same kind of response that we have. It's really an allergic response. So that is where there's a certain kind of cell called the eosinophil that's active, and it kind of spits its insides out in order to try to kill the parasite. But in this case, you know, or it is tuned to direct that at an allergen. And then we have kind of more of a tolerance reaction. And so so when we look at, what's happening with people's immune systems, there a lot more people have allergic atopic presentations, and also a lot of people are having this autoimmune reaction, which is basically that type of reaction that's supposed to be to a bacteria or virus that gets turned the wrong direction towards our own cells. And the idea with this, about parasites being potentially mutualistic, is that our bodies have adapted to having that kind of response to parasites. And so if we don't have parasites, now all of a sudden our immune system is sort of overactivated in other directions. And, I think there's a lot to be said for that. And also a lot to be said for the fact of this being a very new thing in all of human history and mammalian history, is that that we have such clean food, that we have such clean water. So very new, and that we are exposed to so many antimicrobials as well. That's a really new thing as well. So we're always running a big experiment, right? So here we are with an extra 40 years of our lives, and we're running a big experiment to see how we can do that. And the current one involves us being exposed to a lot of antimicrobials and really clean food. And so it might be that autoimmunity and atopic presentations are a side effect of that. It also might be that those things are completely unrelated to any of this, and that they have more to do with something else entirely. But I actually do really, this immunologist that I've seen present a few times, Heather's Wiki, really wonderful. You'll see I'll be referencing some of the things that came out of her talks, but really what she talks about is how much that the microbiome really deeply affects something called Tregs, which is basically the type of cell that kind of like regulates the type of immune response. And often that's what's sort of missing when we have autoimmunity, and I mean the Tregs are low when we have autoimmunity and atopic presentation. So let's look at the beneficial effects of the bacteria, and then sort of go through what we're gonna, sort of what we can do to support the bacteria. We're gonna do like a little intro this time about what we can do to support the bacteria, and then moving into next week, we're gonna talk more about what we can do to therapeutics and foods that really support the good bacteria. So bacteria, they actually produce some of our nutrients. So the ones we know about are vitamin K, and then a bunch of the B vitamins, like thiamine, folate, biotin, riboflavin, and pantothenic acid. Also, there's B12 has a really complex way of getting into your body, of being absorbed, and bacteria are necessary to that whole process as well. So bacteria also help you break down and digest your food, specifically some of the more hard to digest foods like cellulose, things with fibers in them and cellulose, that bacteria really doing a lot of the heavy lifting on that digestion. That's one of the things, is that very often if people introduce fiber too quickly, so if any of you have had me, recommend psyllium or flax seeds, a lot of times I recommend, depending on if a person already eats a lot of vegetables, a lot of times I'll recommend a slow increase in that. And that's partially because if you introduce fiber really quickly, your body has trouble breaking it down. But if you introduce it slowly, you're basically feeding the bacteria that help you break it down, and then that those levels get high enough so that you don't have as much of the flatulence from eating the fibers. So a lot of times we actually have to kind of work up to that. So if you're a person who has tried eating a lot more vegetables, or tried taking in more fiber in any form, and has had quite a lot of bloating, gas, digestive upset, the trick is to kind of like reel it back and then take it slow, slowly introduce more and more, so that your bacteria can catch up and help you digest that food. So bacteria also produce short chain fatty acids, which nourish the lining of your digestive tract. And a lot of you have heard of intestinal permeability, or leaky gut is another name for it. that is when the cells of the lining of the GI tract don't stick together quite as well, and things like proteins can pass over, but also bacteria. So proteins from food that aren't really adequately broken down can pass over and create more inflammation, and also bacteria can cross over. And so basically what we really want is for the lining of our GI tract to be very strong and to be, not overly permeable. And so the short chain fatty acids are a big component of that. The other thing is glutamine, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about cabbage and sauerkraut, because those are really good sources of glutamine. So the and also short chain fatty acids are also really important for prevention of colon cancer. Now, what's really interesting is some people take short chain fatty acids as, kind of trying to replicate this. And it does seem like we can't fully replicate it by just taking the short chain fatty acids. So my assumption is when I hear that is that there's probably another metabolite that's also effective in reducing inflammation that's present with the bacteria are producing along with the short chain fatty acids. But that's just an idea, because what we do see is that when people take it, it's not as effective as when the bacteria are producing it. So you can't really make up for the lack of bacteria by just sort of taking the metabolites. There are certain circumstances where it can be helpful, but I think that kind of big picture, the best thing we can do is really support the full diversity, the full ecosystem of our bacteria and our whole microbiome. So, and then, bacteria really affect immune system function. So there's a couple of different ways that we can talk about that. One is about autoimmune conditions and how there's been a lot of questions and research about the relationship between the microbiome and autoimmune conditions. And some of that has to do with this idea that, like, when your microbiome is really healthy, you produce more of these Treg cells that help to modulate the immune system so that you're not getting these like inflammatory reactions that are not helpful. The other thing that came out of recent COVID research was about really looking at people who had more severe COVID had less diverse and microbiomes and didn't have as much of the good bacteria. And there's kind of like a lot of questions about those findings, which is like, people who did the research or first talked about the research were saying like, oh, look, this means that people who didn't have good complete microbiomes, that they responded more poorly to COVID. And we can't really say that there's a causal factor because we don't know what it was like before that. Is it that, COVID as a virus really affected the human, mucosal surface? And like if people are watching who have had COVID, a lot of people had kind of like really changes to their nasal mucosa. Some people felt like a really dry nasal mucosa. Later sort of variants seem to also have more congestion, but kind of earlier variants, there's a lot of dryness. And so when I think about that, that could very easily change the microbial balance. If that, if all the mucous membranes were affected in that kind of a way where there's less of a mucus barrier or mucus, sort of available for the bacteria. So that's a little bit questionable, but there is some question of whether or not the microbiome really was part of the outcomes that we, part of the sort of variable outcomes that we saw to COVID infections. And then there are so many other things that are sort of like coming up as being, relationships, like even between the microbiome and heart health and the microbiome and mental health. And I just feel like this is going to be something we're going to learn about more and more, because basically where we are in that kind of, process in terms of understanding things is that now we're able to identify more and more microbes. And then we're starting to understand relationships between microbes and health outcomes. And what's a very tough thing to do is to determine where is the causal relationship. Is it that, we have a lot of this microbe because that person eats a lot of asparagus, and also that person has less of a chance of colon cancer because they eat a lot of asparagus, or is it because of the bacteria that's present? So So it's pretty hard to establish some of these causal relationships, but they have ways really by introducing, different bacteria, using them therapeutically kind of gives us a little bit more of a window into what kind of effects each of the bacteria has. I've been using a lab, Genova has a lab called GIFX, and it gives you actually a breakdown of all these different bacteria. I think it does like 30 different bacteria that are kind of like the most common, or that are kind of known, and something is known about them in terms of their effects. And it's pretty fascinating. Like, it makes me actually go like look up all these bacteria that I literally have never heard of before, because I'm not even sure if people knew what they were when I was in medical school, partially because of this DNA sequencing. There's so much more knowledge about bacteria. So definitely, that's a real learning curve for all of us, everywhere, like even the scientists who are working on it. We're learning a lot more about bacteria and all of their many effects, but also really, what bacteria do make up a person's microbiome, and then what does that mean? Pretty interesting stuff. I mean, I think whenever people get that lab result back, I always say, there's a lot we don't know about this, but this is what we do know. Some of the things that we do know for sure are that looking at the ratio between Firmicutes and Bacteroides, which are two classes of bacteria, families or classes, they're two of the bigger groups of bacteria. And that can give us some insight about, whether or not we need to, whether that is kind of a microbiome that's kind of tending towards a little bit more inflammation or a little bit less inflammation. So basically everything I'm saying right now is very controversial, and probably I'm going to, need to take this down in a few years, because there'll be a lot of updates on what we know about bacteria. So, so how do we support good bacteria? And this is something the whole session next week is going to be about this, but really, eating foods that feed our good bacteria, known as prebiotics. And then those are foods that are kind of the preferred foods for our bacteria. And then avoiding unnecessary antibiotics. So, so sometimes we, for example, antibiotics for sinus infection, the research has really shown that they're not that effective for sinus infections, but often, unless the sinus infection has been going on for 2 weeks. So very often a person will get an antibiotic and attribute the resolution of their sinus infection to that antibiotic, but when they've done studies, it doesn't show any real difference in the outcome. So, there is that, very often that attribution of it is because the timing of when you get the antibiotics would be when the sinus infection would improve, especially if it was a viral sinus infection. Of course, there's many different scenarios where that doesn't apply, for people who are immunocompromised, or if there's, signs that it's a bacterial sinus infection. So, but there's a lot of, unnecessary antibiotics that are out there. Even some of like the stronger antimicrobial soaps are really not necessary, unless you're a surgeon or, engaging in something where, you have to be very careful about transmission of just regular soap is very effective at reducing the bacteria levels on our hands. Another thing we can do to really support our good bacteria is consuming a little bit less of the animal products, alcohol, and sugars that really promote the growth of the more kind of pro-inflammatory bacteria, and also the fungi. And those are the Firmicutes and the Ruminococcus, which those are the more kind of ones that are associated more with inflammation. And again, that's not 100%. There's exceptions to that statement. So generally, like I always say, things always come back to vegetables and exercise. And here we are again, and sleep. Here we are again at eating more vegetables provides us with the prebiotics that feed our good bacteria, that then promote diversity in our microbiome, and also promote health of our microbiome. So there's this project called the American Gut Project, which is a really interesting, like, crowdsourced project where people send in specimens, and then they're able to look at all of these specimens and then correlate them with people's medical conditions and everything, and try to establish these relationships, or these known relationships, whether they're causal or not. Just knowing that, like, you know, people with IBS tend to have more of this bacteria, or something like that. So anyway, the American Gut Project, one of the things that has definitely come out of that is really showing that that people who eat 30 or more plant-based foods per week have a much more diverse microbiome than people who eat 10 or less different plant foods a week. So we're not just talking about servings, we're talking about different foods per week. And this sounds like a totally overwhelming number, but it's actually surprisingly easy to get to, mostly because there's a couple of classes that it includes that are kind of easy to get a bunch of. So spices, so all kinds of, you know, and I know when I've done this experiment in the past that it's gotten me to use a lot more spices because I'm trying to get to my 30. So what the experiment is for this week is to try getting 30 different plant-based foods. So that means, you know, it can be like all different kinds of vegetables, all kinds of different kinds of fruits, all different kinds of grains, all different kinds of spices. Though each one counts as its own plant-based food, you know, and nuts and seeds are also, you know, those count. So really, you might be surprised at how easy it is. What I really found for myself was that it was really easy to get to 25, and then I had to like work for the other 5. You know, I had to go like certain kind of being like, oh, maybe I'll get, you know, a leek for my food, you know, put in my stir fry this week, because that's another one I can add. So so that's kind of a fun project. One of the ways, you know, in terms of how to track for this, you can just have a piece of paper that you write things on. You can, I just kept it as a note in my phone, so that I could just, whenever I was eating a new plant-based food, I could just add it to the note. You can also make like a little weekly calendar if you kind of want to see on each day how many you ate on each day. You could write it out in a weekly calendar. But however you'd like to track it, and just sort of to see if you get to 30, and then we'll talk next week about what that was like to really shoot for 30, and whether or not you made it, or whether that was hard or easy, or what you felt like when you did that. So, and then there's some resources on the bottom of the handout here. Just if you're interested in learning more, there's so much to learn about with microbiome, you know, just with microbes and microbiomes. And if you want to read a fun, interesting book about microbes and just sort of like the wild world of the microbes, it's a book called I Contain Multitudes by Ed Young. It's really neat book. I actually haven't read the whole thing, but what I have read of it has been pretty wonderful, and written in a very engaging kind of way. And then there's this first link that I put there, which is probably the most important, you know, sort of thing that's happening in terms of medicine and microbiome, is about the microbiome and autoimmune diseases. So that's a good review article. And then if you want to learn more about this idea of like bacteriophages and the virome, which is the viruses that are part of the microbiome, that second link is for that. And then if you want to learn about the Human Microbiome Project, which is where they've been doing a lot more of this DNA sequencing and learning more about all the microbes that make up the microbiome, it's pretty neat to just sort of, you know, learn about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and, you know, how do you even collect this data about, you know, all of these thousands of organisms that are different organisms, and then, you know, these trillions of organisms that are exist, you know, live within our bodies. And then if we want to look at, you know, this Harvard article just has like a good, you know, it does a lot of different talking about the microbiome, defining it and everything, but also talking about the beneficial effects of gut bacteria. So if you have any questions, I'm glad to take them as emails or as phone calls. And yep, I hope we have fun with the 30 plant-based foods project. All right, I'll see you all next week.